Great, thank you everybody. As mentioned, I'm coming from Wisconsin. Much of the data that I'll present is collected from drinking water education programs that we do with rural private landowners, well owners. And the things that we like to do is help them understand, one, is it safe to drink? But two, by collecting that data, we've amassed a pretty large data set that we can then use to help people understand the relationship between land use and their groundwater. So just for those that aren't familiar, Wisconsin is in the central part of the United States. It's one of the Great Lakes states. It's located right here on the map. Here we are in California. We have just a quick overview. If we look at this map, we have different layers of geology, the lowermost being Precambrian, kind of igneous metamorphic rock. That's our basement. All of our groundwater is stored in those geologic layers above that Precambrian unit. There's some sandstones and dolomites in the southern two-thirds of the state. There's a Silurian dolomite on the eastern shores of Lake Michigan. And then covering most of the state is Quaternary deposits that were deposited during glaciations. Mostly sands and gravels, very coarse, a lot of times coarse textured. In parts of the state along the eastern shores, those materials are a little bit finer in texture, which is important as we discuss some of the spatial patterns. Humid-continental climate, 32 inches of precip. Much of our year is, the landscape is snow-covered. We get about 10 inches of recharge occurring mostly through the period from March to May, and our growing season is from April to September. The thing about groundwater in Wisconsin is it's accessible and it's generally really good quality. No issues with salinity, except for the areas where there might be anthropogenic contaminants or naturally occurring contaminants such as arsenic. The vast majority of people could install a well anywhere in the state of Wisconsin and be provided water that is of generally considered good drinking water quality. It's called Wisconsin's buried treasure for a reason. 95% of Wisconsin communities rely on groundwater wells. 850,000 private residential wells, which previous speakers talked about the issues with that, and that they're largely unregulated after construction, so people are under no obligation to treat the water if there is anything wrong. All in total, it amounts to 75% of Wisconsin residents that utilize groundwater. The other thing that's important here, because we get more rain than evaporation or recharge, groundwater also supplies the majority of water for our lakes, rivers, and streams. So we do export nutrients to surface waters. Just an overview of the agricultural activities. We are a dairy state. 13% of the country's milk production, 25% of the United States is cheese production, 1.3 million cows. Just gives you an idea on the lower graph of the types of crops that are grown in our state, the majority being corn, lesser extent hay and soybeans, and then we really start to trail off when we get into the oats, the wheat, the vegetable crops. In total, there's 35 million acres, of which 8.5 million of that is cropland, and the map in the upper right shows the distribution of in orange we have the row crops, and the green is areas where we have forage crops. And the map on the lower right is just showing those areas where we have concentrated animal feeding operations. Those are farms that have greater than 1,000 animal units. That's pretty common. They go all the way up to 15, sometimes even 20,000 animal units. So the nitrate concerns, we do have that concern of exporting nitrate or nitrogen to surface waters, which is an issue because our waters discharge to the Gulf of Mexico and contribute to Gulf hypoxia. But closer to home, the concern is mainly drinking water quality, just because such a large percentage of our population utilizes groundwater as their primary water supply. And there are costs that are mounting regarding nitrate and treating for nitrate in Wisconsin. 47 systems have spent upwards of $32 million. A variety of different techniques that communities will choose. And then private wells, those costs are more difficult to determine because a lot of people probably don't take additional measures. But those that do, a new well on average would cost just over $7,000. bottled water about $200 per person, and then water treatment devices $800 plus $100 per year operating costs. If we look at what we know about spatial distribution of nitrate in Wisconsin, we know quite a bit, just because, again, you could install a well pretty much anywhere in the state and get enough water for a residential household. So these are data that were collected over the last 25, maybe 30 years. It is important to point out that it's displaying the maximum concentration on top. So just because it's red doesn't mean that there's not the possibility of getting lower nitrate water in those locations. It just kind of is used to illustrate the different spatial distribution across the state. In total, we have about 10% of our just under 1 million private wells that would be considered in excess of the drinking water standard, the federal drinking water standard, and definitely concentrated in certain areas. So to help make sense of this data, one of my colleagues created the Wisconsin Well Water Quality Viewer. It's an interactive mapping tool that provides public access to this information in a way that we feel is responsible way of disseminating the information and used by municipalities and private well owners to understand their water quality or kind of local water quality issues and help illustrate that connection between land use and groundwater. Nitrate is one of the 14 different parameters that are summarized, and those are the maps that I'm going to show here. We do display average nitrate concentration by county, and that's this map right here. Those are just municipal boundaries within the state of Wisconsin. And displaying the average, so the highest on this map is 5 to 10 milligrams per liter. We do, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we illustrate this at different scales. So we can go down to a township level, which is a 36 square mile grid cell. Again, showing a little bit finer resolution to that data. It does require a minimum number of samples to characterize a grid cell. So those areas that are in white are areas where we just don't have enough data to feel confident of displaying an average for people to assess water quality. But generally speaking, in the northern portion of Wisconsin, that groundwater is at what we consider to be background or natural levels. And as we get into the southern portions, that's the area where we start to get in concentrations of nitrate in groundwater. And if we want to understand the relationship between agriculture and nitrate loss, it really relates to the types of crops that are being grown. That's one of the primary drivers for the patterns that we see. This is just an overview of cropping systems in the Midwest in different studies that I've surveyed or looked into to kind of put together a picture of what's causing or what's responsible for these different patterns. And we know that corn is a very nutrient-intensive, nitrogen-intensive crop. Corn, soybean, a little bit less. We can incorporate, alfalfa and other legumes into that rotation. And those are all things that can help reduce the overall impact on our groundwater system. When we look at perennial systems, those obviously, especially if they're not production systems, they might not be getting fertilizer or nitrogen inputs. But what we see is that all those studies show kind of this gradient from higher nitrogen-intensive cropping systems leaching the most nitrogen to less intensive leaching lesser amounts. And when we look at putting that information and combining it with our agricultural lands maps, we do see those patterns emerging where the areas where we have a higher density of row crops are areas where we tend to have higher nitrate concentrations in our groundwater. Again, that northern portion of the state is mostly forested lands. Forested because it's a colder climate and historically haven't had a long enough growing season to be economically viable for growing things like corn. One thing to point out is that eastern shore of Wisconsin, you might be looking at the map for agricultural lands and saying, well, it looks like a very intensive agricultural area. Why is the nitrate so much lower in a lot of that eastern shore of Wisconsin? And it relates a lot to the soils and geology, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. The eastern shores typically have heavier textured, finer textured soils, which mean a higher proportion of runoff or maybe acreage that's tile drained as opposed to well drained leaching to groundwater. So some of the other patterns, obviously you need the source, and we feel that agriculture is the primary source or primary driver for the leaching to groundwater. But other things that contribute are areas where we have coarse textured superficial deposits, sand and gravels left behind by the glaciers. And the highlighted regions just show kind of where those areas of most concern are. Notice northern Wisconsin does have a lot of coarse textured deposits. So if agriculture were to move into those regions, we would expect them to illustrate similar patterns to that central portion of the state. If we look at another geologic feature that's important to explaining the nitrate variability, it really is an area of shallow carbonate rock aquifers, areas where the soil is less than 5 feet, and it overlies a cracked, fractured Silurian dolomite rock, which 10,000 years ago would have had a 1 mile sheet of ice on top of it, which I think helps explain kind of the fractured nature of that aquifer system. But again, in those areas where the aquifer is close to the surface or exposed, those are areas where we see more dramatic impacts. So the question we always get is, yeah, my water has nitrate in it, but is it getting better or is it getting worse? And oftentimes private wells don't have the extensive data set necessary to answer that question. But we do have in Wisconsin a number of transient non-community wells. Those are bars, restaurants, churches that are required to test on a frequent or annual basis and required to report those results to our regulatory agency. And if we look at what we can learn about trends in Wisconsin, we chose to do a simple linear regression. This led us to, out of roughly 10,000 wells, we were able to use about 8,600 of them and investigate that question of, has groundwater quality gotten better or worse with respect to nitrate? And the map shows the red or orange dots are wells that increased, the blue dots are wells that decreased, and it's difficult to see, but I promise the maps coming up will be a little bit more intuitive or easy to understand. In total, 87% showed no trend or significant rate of change. 8% had an increasing trend, and 5% had a decreasing trend. This just shows an example of decrease, pretty straightforward. Increase, what's less intuitive to the people I often talk to is that the no trend wells doesn't mean that they're good. It just means that they might be high and they've remained high, or they might remain low and they've remained low, or in some cases it might vary quite frequently from year to year, in which case we can't fit a trend to that data. If we look at the counties where more wells are increasing, this is the picture that we see. If we look at those areas or look and try and understand wells or counties where more are decreasing, this is what we see. And then this is a way to combine the increasing and decreasing. So the areas that are yellow, about the same percentage of wells have increased that have decreased. Those that are in blue, more wells have decreased, and those that are in red, more wells have increased. And what we see is that, what I suspect is happening here is that, the central portion of the state where we have a lot more red wells, those are areas where our growing season has gotten longer, where agricultural activity is starting to migrate north. We've also had in certain parts of the state a conversion of pasture and conservation reserve program land put more into corn production. So I suspect that explains a lot of what we're seeing with respect to nitrate concentrations. What I try to illustrate to people is that in general, groundwater quality appears to be mostly stable, but it can change in the course of our lifetimes. And we do have the ability in areas where we change land use to either increase or decrease. And what direction those nitrate concentrations go is really up to the local communities and local landowners to determine. If we talk about what strategies are available for local landowners, these are the ones that are often talked about most. There's nutrient management, which is kind of creating a stabilization period, but then going beyond that, what are our strategies to reduce it if we're not satisfied with the level or the stabilization of nitrate in the groundwater. And the easy ones to implement, the timing nitrification inhibitors, less than 10% effectiveness, which is good, but if your well is at 15 milligrams per liter, 10% reduction will likely not get you, or your neighbors might not be appreciative of a 10% reduction that doesn't get you below that drinking water standard. Cover crops have some potential, but in Wisconsin, a lot of this data is based off of Iowa, which has a slightly longer growing season. So cover crops might not have as much potential in an area like Wisconsin, because cover crops are much harder to establish prior to winter. Perennial systems and extended rotations really do have the most potential for having the most impact on nitrate issues in Wisconsin. So if we look at conclusions, we know a lot about the spatial distribution and patterns of nitrate in our groundwater. About 10% of wells exceed the standard. The extent and areas are well identified, mainly related to the land use, heightened by the geology and soils. Temporally, most wells don't show significant change. They might be low to begin with in an area of low susceptibility, or they might be impacted but just not changing because they're in equilibrium with the land use. And then 5% of wells show a decreasing trend. It's difficult without having detailed data from the landscape to know if it's related to a change in land use or better management. 8% of wells show an increasing trend. Again, is that due to a change in land use, expanded agricultural activity, or climate change, which we would expect, as we move forward, northern Wisconsin to be warmer and more attractive to agricultural production. So I do feel that in the future that is a concern for those northern Wisconsin communities. And with that, that's all I have. I'd like to open it up to any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Kevin. Questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. One is, you have some no data area when you determine it's not sufficient valid. And how do you determine that? That would be one question.
It was fairly arbitrary.
Okay.
The 36 square mile area, there's a lot of those portions where there might not be any residential wells. So in terms of what was the minimum amount of data we needed, we said 5 samples. If we get much more restrictive than that, say 10 samples or 20 samples, we really lose that ability to characterize statewide what the nitrate picture looks like. So that was chosen as a way to try to get at that spatial picture. If we make it a little bit more finer resolution in terms of the number of samples we need, we start to lose a lot of resolution.
And then the second question is, who has been using your well viewer?
Who has been using the well water viewer? We track statistics, and judging by where people are accessing it, it does look like Madison is our state capital. We get a lot of hits or a lot of people from Madison utilizing it, so state agencies. I use it a lot in my outreach educational programming, where people often want to know, why is my water contaminated with nitrate, or other parameters that we might investigate. And this is really a tool that we can use to help them, one, understand it, but then they can also go back to it and do some investigation on their own. So right now it's primarily an outreach tool that we use, but we hope that it provides some ability for management decisions at a state or local level.
Question about the use of those private wells. Mm-hmm. I assume they differ in depth related to the groundwater level and the screen length. Did you look into that, whether it influenced your results?
Great question, and they do vary. We don't have detailed data on a lot of wells. After 1988, we have much better well construction information. So the vast majority of data points, we don't have accurate well construction information to look at those relationships. What I can say though is that typical well construction in Wisconsin, we're looking at 150 to 200 feet. And in a given area, the construction is going to be very similar from one neighbor to another. There's not a lot of areas where you're going to have somebody that's got a well 100 feet and somebody next to him has a well that's 600 feet. The well drillers that drill in that area typically drill to, what they know, and it's very similar well construction. So this is a good assessment of shallow groundwater quality. It's not looking at, deeper groundwater quality issues that municipalities might be relying on.
Thank you, Kevin.